Mr. Blair, I'd like to start with the first of the areas that Sir John has just mentioned. The way that the government, under your leadership, developed its broad strategy on Iraq in 2001 and into the early months of 2002. And if I can just summarize the situation at the beginning of this, since 1991, a strategy of containment operated internationally and with UN backing through an arms embargo, trade sanctions, no-fly zones, naval embargo, stationing of coalition forces in the region, had prevented Saddam Hussein from threatening his neighbors or from developing nuclear weapons. But at the same time, there were concerns by 2001, as there had been all along in many ways, about his aspirations, his efforts to break out, his missile development program, intelligence about his CW, his chemical weapons and biological weapons capabilities, the leakage and the growing unpopularity of sanctions, which we've heard from a number of previous witnesses, and the enforcement of the no-fly zones. We'll come in detail onto the WMD issues later on. The policy that your government and the United States administration under the newly elected President Bush adopted in 2001 through parallel reviews of Iraq policy was to reinforce this strategy of containment, to strengthen it. And the two governments led the way in putting forward what was called a smart sanctions resolution at the United Nations. Didn't succeed in getting the UN Security Council to adopt that in the summer of 2001, though it was eventually adopted in May of 2002 as Security Council Resolution 1409. Now, in that period, what was the view that you took of this strategy of containment? Or perhaps I could divide the period. Before 9/11, how did you view containment?
I think it's absolutely right to divide our policies, Roderick, up into two separate parts. Up to September the 11th, after September the 11th. Up to September the 11th, Saddam was still a problem, a major problem. The sanctions framework was eroding. There were continual breaches of the no-fly zone. We were actually worried about enforcing the no-fly zone. You've probably seen, I think, correspondence from Robin Cook at the time to me about that. There was an attempt to put in place a different form of sanctions, these so-called smart sanctions, and perhaps we can come to that in detail a little later. And, of course, the very first military action I'd taken was with President Clinton back in 1998 against Saddam.
And we'll come back to that later, too.
And that's actually a very important moment as well. But, however, I think I would fairly describe our policy up to September the 11th as doing our best, hoping for the best, but with a different calculus of risk assessment. In other words, up to September the 11th, we thought he was a risk, but we thought it was worth trying to contain it. The crucial thing after September the 11th is that the calculus of risk changed.
I'll come on to that in just a minute. But in the period up to September the 11th, effectively, would it be right to say that containment as a broad strategy had been effective, was still sustainable, needed reinforcing, was expensive and difficult? That's roughly speaking what we've heard from some earlier witnesses, including Sir John Sawers, who was working for you at the time. He said, I think it was working, but the costs of it were quite high and there were risks to the various elements of our policy that we wanted to reduce. Would that be a fair summary?
I think the way I would put it is this, that the sanctions were obviously eroding. We couldn't get support for them. The so-called smart sanctions framework, we actually, prior to September the 11th, couldn't get support for at that time.
Yep.
So we were in a bit of a difficulty there. And of course, the fact is that Saddam, as I say, we take a military action in 1998. There is a very long history, of course, of the dealings with Saddam. One of the things I've done for the purpose of the inquiry is go back through my speeches prior to September the 11th. And I mean, I've actually got one or two of them here, but it's just quite interesting.
I want to refer back to one or two of them later on, as I'm sure colleagues will.
Well, let me summarise their impact then. Their impact is regularly through 1997, 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001, I am saying Saddam must comply with the UN resolutions and force as an option. But all of this, frankly, was in circumstances where this wasn't the top priority for us. And I remember at the very first meeting that we had, myself and President Bush, in February 2001, just after he had come to power as President of the United States, we dealt with Iraq with Colin Powell, but it was very much in the context of trying to get a different sanctions framework in place.
So if I put it in rather simple terms, he hadn't at this point broken out of the box that he'd been put in, although there were some holes in the box. Would that be?
Yeah, but the holes were quite substantial.
Yeah, they needed attention.
Yes.
Okay.
But it's really the critical thing, and Swadra, if you forgive me for interrupting, but it's absolutely essential to realise this. If September the 11th hadn't happened, our assessment of the risk of allowing Saddam any possibility of him reconstituting his programs would not have been the same. But after September the 11th, and if you'd like me to now, I'll explain what a difference that made to the thinking. After September the 11th, our view, the American view, changed and changed dramatically.